December 12, 1944. The cold came early that year. In the flatlands of the American Midwest, the fields lay hard as iron, the soil sealed by frost. Corn stalks stood brittle and gray, rattling like bones when the wind cut across the open prairie. On that morning, the sun barely lifted through a gauze of low clouds, and the sound that broke the stillness was not the hum of tractors or the chatter of farmhands, but the scrape of boots and the clink of chains. German prisoners of war were arriving at the farm. They came in a guarded column, wrapped in wool coats issued by the U.S. Army but patched with remnants of their old uniforms. A few still wore caps marked with faded insignia, though most had long since surrendered any pride in symbols. Their breath streamed in white plumes as they trudged forward, eyes fixed on the ground, their shoulders stooped against the cold. Some of them were barely 20. Others carried the weariness of men in their 30s who had fought too long in a war that no longer promised glory. Every step carried a weight heavier than frost, the weight of propaganda that told them Americans would despise and destroy them. For years, the German High Command had painted a picture of the United States as a land of cruelty, of factories run by Jews, of civilians who would spit on captives and starve them in camps. Many of these men had listened to that voice. They believed they would be beaten, perhaps shot if they faltered in their labor. The fear clung to them, mixed with the hunger gnawing at their stomachs. The rations on the ships that had carried them across the Atlantic had been meager, and the long train rides through endless stretches of America had offered little more. When they stepped onto this snowbound farm, they braced for the same. Waiting for them was a woman. She stood at the edge of the yard, a shawl wrapped tight over her shoulders, her hands red from the cold. She was in her 40s, her husband gone overseas with the infantry, her eldest boy just 16 and trying to hold the farm together. She had not asked for prisoners of war to be brought to her property. Yet the labor shortage made their presence necessary. Sugar beets had to be pulled, wood had to be chopped, and animals had to be tended. Without men, the burden fell on women, children, and now these captives. Her name is lost to history, as so many small actors in great dramas are, but her figure was common in wartime America. Strong-backed, weary-eyed, unwilling to let the land fail. When she looked at the Germans being marched up her lane, she saw not the enemy from newsreels, but tired men wrapped in rags, their boots leaving shallow dents in the snow. Still, she did not smile. Her jaw was set, her eyes steady. Mercy was not weakness, but neither was it softness. The guard escorting them gave clipped orders. The prisoners would work in the field. They would not enter the house. They would not linger near the barn without permission. The woman listened, nodding. Yet even as the soldiers spoke, the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent from her kitchen, cornbread rising in the oven, beans simmering on the stove, apple preserves warming by the hearth. The smell drifted across the yard like a quiet rebellion against the machinery of war. The Germans lifted their heads, noses twitching. For a moment, their eyes met in shared disbelief. Could that smell, sweet, savory, homebound, possibly be for them? The woman noticed their hesitation. She remembered her husband's words before shipping out. Keep the farm alive. Don't let bitterness turn your heart to stone. She had repeated those words to herself many times, though some nights they felt like hollow comfort. Her husband was somewhere in Europe now, perhaps even fighting men like these. And here they were, standing in her yard, half-starved, half-frozen, expecting punishment. Inside the farmhouse, her children peered out through the frosted window. The youngest asked, whispering, "Mama, are they bad men?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched as one of the prisoners, a thin fellow with hollow cheeks, stumbled and nearly fell. Another caught him by the arm. The woman tightened her shawl around her shoulders, a sign both of chill and decision. Historical records show that by late 1944, America housed nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war in more than 500 camps. Many of them were dispatched daily to farms, factories, and sawmills. The U.S. War Department, bound by the Geneva Convention, ensured that these prisoners were treated humanely, sometimes even better than what civilians in occupied Europe endured. Reports tell of German captives who gained weight in American custody, astonished by the abundance of food in a nation untouched by bombing. But policies written in Washington did not dictate the daily, human encounters. Those belonged to women like her, standing at the threshold of their own kitchens, deciding what to do with the enemy. The guards began moving the men toward the field, but the woman raised her voice. "Wait!" The single word hung in the frosty air. The soldiers looked at her, puzzled. She pointed toward the porch, then to the kitchen. "They'll eat first." The Germans froze, exchanging bewildered glances. One muttered under his breath, in a dialect thick with Rhineland roots, "It's a trick." Another shook his head. "No, it smells real." Their bodies, trained to obey, didn't move until the guards gestured reluctantly for them to follow. The farmhouse door swung open, and warmth spilled into the yard. The smell of beans and bread rolled out like a tide, impossible to resist. The prisoners shuffled forward, hesitating on the steps as though expecting a blow. Inside, a long wooden table stood waiting, rough-hewn but clean, with mismatched plates laid out in a row. The woman motioned for them to sit. Her children lingered in the corner, wide-eyed, while the guards remained watchful near the door. The prisoners sat slowly, stiff in their coats, hands hovering uncertainly over the table. Their eyes flicked toward the window, the stove, the food steaming in bowls. Hunger gnawed at them, but suspicion held them back. They had been told Americans were monsters. Yet here, in this plain farmhouse on a frozen December morning, a woman was setting cornbread before them as if they were weary travelers rather than captured enemies. One of the men dared to taste first. He broke a piece of bread, butter melting against the crust, steam rising into his face. His eyes widened. Then he ate, quick and desperate. The others followed, tentatively at first, then with a hunger that drowned their caution. The room filled with the sound of chewing, of spoons clinking against bowls, of life being momentarily restored. The woman stood at the head of the table, watching. She did not join them. She simply ensured each plate was filled, each bowl passed. Her expression remained unreadable, but in her silence was a declaration louder than any sermon. The prisoners ate until the bowls were empty. Some lowered their heads, ashamed at their greed, others sat back with tears pricking at the corners of their eyes. For them, this meal was not just food, it was the crumbling of an illusion. Outside, the wind still howled across the frozen fields. The war still raged an ocean away. But inside this farmhouse, for the briefest of mornings, enemies sat at the same table, and none of them could fully understand what it meant. And as the last crust of bread vanished from the table, one thought lingered in the minds of the prisoners. If this was how America treated its enemies, what else lay ahead that they could not have imagined? The table stretched like a line of truce between two worlds. At one end stood the American woman, arms crossed, her shawl still dusted with flakes of snow. At the other sat a row of German prisoners, shoulders hunched, hands resting uneasily on their knees. The smell of food lingered in the air, thick and tempting, yet hesitation held them still. They had been marched across half a continent with nothing but warnings of cruelty. Now, confronted with steaming bowls of beans and slabs of cornbread, they were unsure if this was nourishment or mockery. The guards exchanged quick glances. Feeding the prisoners was permitted under the Geneva Convention, even required, but not every farmer welcomed the arrangement with such direct generosity. Most workers ate in the barn or in makeshift sheds, not at the table of the people whose sons they might be fighting overseas. Yet here, in this farmhouse, the woman made no distinction. A place at the table meant a measure of dignity, and dignity was not something these men expected to find in captivity. Slowly, the first prisoner reached for bread. He tore it with trembling fingers, butter sliding onto his skin, and raised it to his lips. The sweetness startled him. He chewed quickly, as if the taste itself might vanish if he hesitated. Others followed, cautious at first, then with growing urgency. Wooden spoons scraped against enamel bowls, beans thick with salt and fat disappearing as though devoured by men who had forgotten what abundance felt like. The children watched from the corner, silent as shadows. The eldest boy, just tall enough to look a prisoner in the eye, frowned with suspicion. His father was somewhere across the Atlantic, and in his youthful mind the enemy should never share their bread. But his mother's face left no room for argument. She kept her chin high, lips pressed firm, her gaze steady as though daring anyone to challenge her decision. Outside, the wind hammered against the walls. Inside, warmth grew. The stove popped and crackled, casting flickers of orange light across the Germans' hollow faces. One of them, a blond soldier with scars etched across his cheek, let out a low sigh. Another closed his eyes as he chewed, the lines of hunger momentarily softening. They were captives, yes, but for the first time in months they felt something resembling safety. Historical records confirm such moments were not isolated. In camps across the United States, POWs often remarked with astonishment at the quality of their rations. In some cases they ate better than civilians in Europe. American abundance, powered by factories and farms far from the devastation of war, stood in shocking contrast to the shortages back home. One German officer later wrote that American pies contained more sugar than entire German households had seen in a year. The woman moved quietly between them, refilling bowls, sliding more bread onto chipped plates. She did not linger, did not smile. Her silence was both command and compassion. The Germans accepted what she offered, but their eyes flicked toward her with every movement, searching for the trap that never came. Suspicion clung to them like the frost on their boot. The eldest prisoner, a man in his mid-30s with streaks of gray already in his hair, finally broke the silence. His voice was low, his accent heavy. "Why?" The single word carried across the table, and though it was spoken in German, the meaning was clear enough. Why would the enemy feed them this way? Why risk kindness when cruelty was easier? The woman met his gaze. She did not answer. Instead, she set down another dish, beans steaming against the chill of the room, then returned to her place at the head of the table. The silence stretched, but no further questions came. Words would not bridge the gap tonight. Only bread and pie could do that. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably. He had grown up on a nearby farm, knew the sting of losing cousins and neighbors to the front lines. Watching Germans eat like honored guests made his jaw tighten. Later, he would admit that a part of him wanted to drag them back to the barn, let them freeze, let hunger gnaw. But the woman's authority outweighed his bitterness. This was her farm, her table, and her decision. The prisoners ate until their bellies ached. For men accustomed to watery cabbage soup and coarse rye, the richness of beans cooked with pork fat was overwhelming. The pie, sliced unevenly but dripping with sweetness, nearly broke them. One man laughed, a short, sharp sound quickly stifled, as he licked sugar from his fingers. Another muttered something about dreaming. The humor cut through the heaviness. Even the children smirked when one prisoner sneezed violently after swallowing too quickly. For a fleeting moment, the war outside seemed far away, and the farmhouse felt like a place untouched by history. But reality pressed at the edges. Every laugh was shadowed by the knowledge that these men had once carried rifles aimed at American sons. Every spoonful of beans was a reminder that generosity could blur lines meant to remain sharp. As the plates emptied, quiet settled over the room. The Germans leaned back, some resting hands over full stomachs, others lowering their heads in unspoken gratitude. They did not thank her aloud, not yet. Pride and shame wrestled too fiercely within them. But in their eyes something shifted, a glimmer of disbelief giving way to respect. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was even, deliberate. "You'll work tomorrow. Hard work. The fields don't forgive laziness." Her words were not tender. They were practical, unyielding. But in that practicality lay a strange mercy. Work meant purpose, purpose meant survival. The eldest boy stiffened beside her, as if her speech betrayed the family. But she laid a hand gently on his shoulder, a signal that strength sometimes looked different than vengeance. He said nothing more. In the corner, the guards signaled the meal was done. Chairs scraped against wood. The prisoners stood, some bowing their heads briefly toward the woman, others keeping their eyes low. They filed out into the cold again, breath rising in clouds, their stomachs heavy with food they had not imagined tasting. Later, some would write in censored letters home about this meal. They would not name her, but they would describe the bread, the beans, the pie. They would describe the strangeness of being fed not like animals, but like men. And though their letters would be clipped by censors, those memories would outlast the war itself. Back inside, the woman cleared the plate. Her children asked questions she did not answer. She moved with quiet efficiency, as though feeding the enemy was simply another chore, like milking cows or stacking wood. But when she paused by the window, watching the line of prisoners vanish into the night, her hand lingered against the glass. Her husband was somewhere across the sea, fighting against men who looked exactly like those she had just fed. And as she stood there, torn between duty and compassion, the weight of her decision pressed heavier than the snow-laden sky. The war was not only fought with guns and bombs. Sometimes it was fought at a table, where bread replaced bullets and silence carried more power than speeches. But what none of them yet knew, neither the woman, nor the guards, nor the prisoners full of beans and pie, was that this single act of defiance against cruelty would ripple beyond her kitchen. For the Germans, it would become a memory that reshaped what they believed about America. And for her, it would test the fragile boundary between patriotism and humanity. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither side had expected. Each morning, the prisoners were marched from the temporary camp to the farm, boots crunching across snow-packed earth, their breath puffing into the dawn. They labored in silence at first, their hands raw from the cold, pulling sugar beets from frozen ground, stacking wood against the barn, repairing fences that bowed under winter weight. The guards watched closely, rifles slung at their shoulders, though the need for force diminished with each passing day. Hunger had been the first whip, now the promise of food became the unspoken contract. The woman moved among them with the same steady presence she carried at her table. She gave instructions with a clipped voice, not cruel, not soft. When a prisoner struggled with the milking stool, she corrected him with a simple gesture, showing how to lean against the cow without spooking her. When another fumbled with the axe, she demonstrated the proper swing. No lectures, no indulgence. Just work because the farm demanded it. Yet beneath that pragmatism was an undercurrent the men could not ignore. She treated them not as animals of war, but as men capable of learning. The younger children grew bolder. They lingered at the edges of the yard, whispering to one another in half-curious, half-fearful tones. Once, the youngest dared to wave at a prisoner, a boyish-looking soldier who might have been no older than her eldest brother. He hesitated, glancing at the guard, then returned the wave with a small, almost shy flick of his hand. The gesture earned a stern glare from the guard, but the woman did not intervene. She let it stand, as though some lines of humanity could stretch without breaking. Historical records tell us that such moments of contact were common. German prisoners worked across 46 American states, harvesting crops, chopping timber, even canning fruit. Farmers depended on them, but many civilians carried resentment. Sons were dying overseas, and here their enemies were eating well, even growing stronger. Local newspapers sometimes reported angry letters. Why should Germans dine while our boys starve at the front? Yet for others, especially those grounded in faith, kindness to the stranger was not betrayal, it was obligation. This woman seemed to embody the latter conviction. Her kitchen became the center of a quiet defiance against bitterness. One afternoon, a prisoner named Karl, thin and sharp-eyed, stumbled while carrying a crate of feed. The wood split, grain spilling across the snow. He cursed under his breath in German, and the guard barked at him to pick it up faster. Before he could kneel, the woman strode across the yard. Without a word, she crouched, scooped up the frozen kernels with her bare hands, and shoved them back into the broken crate. The prisoners stared, startled by the sight of their supposed enemy dirtying her hands beside them. Carl's lips parted as though to speak, but she rose first, brushing her palms against her shawl. "Be quicker next time," she said simply, then walked away. It was not forgiveness, but it was something more dangerous: recognition. That night, the prisoners ate again at her table. Their suspicion had not vanished, but hunger was no longer their only guide. They chewed more slowly now, studying her, studying the children, even daring to exchange small glances of relief with one another. One tried his English, halting and awkward. "Good food." The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. The eldest boy scoffed under his breath, but his mother gave the prisoner a short nod, the barest acknowledgment that his words had reached her. Letters written by POWs during those months, preserved in archives, reveal a startling theme: gratitude. They describe the abundance of meals, the fairness of work hours, even the decency of guards. Some claimed they ate better in captivity than their own families did in Germany. One wrote, "I do not understand how the enemy can give us such food. It is against everything we were told." That disbelief simmered now in the farmhouse, where propaganda collided daily with reality. Still, hostility lingered at the edges. When the prisoners were marched back to camp each evening, townsfolk sometimes spat on the ground near them. Children in schoolyards mocked them, pretending to goose-step and shouting slurs. The war's wounds were too fresh, too raw, to allow easy reconciliation. The woman knew this. Each time she opened her table, she risked the judgment of neighbors who might accuse her of coddling killers. Yet each time she set down a dish, she felt the weight of her faith pressing stronger than the weight of her fear. Humor slipped into the cracks of daily life. One morning, a prisoner eager to impress grabbed the stool too quickly while milking, and the cow kicked the bucket clean across the barn. Milk splattered everywhere. The children erupted in laughter, clutching their stomachs, while the guards tried to maintain stern expressions. Even the woman's lips twitched in something close to a smile before she turned sharply away. Moments like that reminded everyone that clumsy men could exist even in uniforms. By late December, the ground was iron-hard, work slowed, and nights grew longer. The prisoners sometimes sang softly as they walked back to camp, old folk tunes from the Rhineland carried on frosty air. The woman listened once from her porch, the sound haunting her. She thought of her husband overseas, somewhere in France, hearing different songs, songs drowned by artillery. She wrapped the shawl tighter and returned inside, but the music lingered like a ghost. One evening, after the table had been cleared and the guards were waiting to march them back, the eldest prisoner hesitated near the door. He struggled with his words, his English broken but determined. "Your husband, he fight us. You still—" His voice trailed off, searching for the right phrase. "You still give food." The woman held his gaze. Her eyes did not soften, but they did not harden either. "Men must eat," she said. "Even enemies." Her tone was flat, final. But inside the prisoners, those words carved deeper than sermons. They had been told America was ruthless, merciless, a nation of machines. Yet here was a woman who saw them as men first, soldiers second. As they filed out, the eldest boy whispered fiercely to his mother, "Papa's out there, fighting men like them. You shouldn't." She rested her hand briefly on his arm. "Your father fights so we don't lose who we are. Remember that." It was the closest she came to explaining her choice. The boy said nothing more, but his eyes lingered on the retreating prisoners. They vanished into the snowy dark, their breath clouds dissolving in the night. The boy's heart held confusion, a mixture of anger and awe. He did not yet know which would win. And as the farmhouse fell quiet again, a new tension settled in the air, not of suspicion, but of something more dangerous, more fragile. For the prisoners, suspicion was giving way to gratitude. For the woman, duty was becoming entangled with compassion. And for her son, loyalty was colliding with the unsettling truth that kindness could sometimes feel like betrayal. What none of them could foresee was how this fragile balance would be tested when the war outside finally came knocking on their door in ways they could not ignore. By the spring of 1945, the war's horizon had shifted. News filtered across the ocean, through radios humming in kitchens and headlines stacked in town squares. The Allies pushing deeper into Germany, cities in ruins, the Reich collapsing. At the farm, life carried on with its rhythm of chores and seasons, yet everyone sensed that an ending approached. The prisoners felt it most sharply. They worked with a strange urgency, aware that their days in America were numbered, their return to a broken homeland looming like a shadow. The woman still set her table. Each meal carried the same ritual: bowls of beans, bread stacked in cloth-lined baskets, pies when sugar rations allowed. The prisoners no longer hesitated to eat. They chewed with gratitude, but also with a quiet sorrow, as though memorizing each bite. These meals were no longer merely food. They were the final notes of a song they feared would never be sung again. The eldest boy's suspicion lingered. He carried firewood with clenched fists, his gaze sharp on the Germans who laughed softly among themselves after supper. His resentment grew each time a letter arrived from overseas with only silence where his father's handwriting should have been. To him, every spoonful given to the enemy was a betrayal. But his mother's resolve did not waver. She moved through her tasks with quiet defiance, determined that compassion was not weakness, that her husband's fight was not dishonored by her bread. History tells us that such conflicts of conscience were common. In towns across America, farmers were divided. Some treated POWs with suspicion, forcing them to eat apart, reminding them daily of their defeat. Others, like this woman, insisted that feeding men was an act of faith, not politic. Reports from the War Department noted that German morale often rose in such environments, leading to smoother work and fewer escape. What the reports did not capture was the deeper transformation, the way a meal could reshape an enemy into a human being. One evening, after the day's labor, the prisoners lingered longer at the table. Conversation, once guarded, began to surface in fragments of broken English and German. One man asked about the children's schooling. Another traced the grain of the wooden table with his finger and murmured, "This would, like my father's house." The woman listened without comment, her face impassive, but inside she felt the fragile threads of humanity weaving across language and war. It was then that one of the youngest prisoners, barely more than a boy, produced a small carving. He had whittled it from scrap wood during breaks in the field, a bird, wings outstretched, rough but careful. He slid it across the table toward the youngest child. The room fell silent. The guard shifted, unsure if this was mischief or gift. The child's eyes widened, fingers hovering over the bird. The woman looked at the boy, then at the prisoner, then gave a single nod. The carving was accepted. For the Germans, it was a small rebellion against the identity of enemy. For the family, it was a symbol that kindness could cross even the most guarded lines. Still, the war crept closer. Rumors of atrocities reached the farm, stories of camps in Europe where starvation and death reigned. Some locals questioned whether kindness to German soldiers was blindness to suffering elsewhere. The woman felt the sting of those whispers in church pews and at market stalls. Yet when she returned home, the sight of hollow-eyed men eating her bread silenced her doubts. War was fought on many fronts, she told herself. Hers was a table. By summer, word came. The Germans would soon be shipped back. The announcement spread unease through the camp. Some men welcomed it, yearning for their homeland despite its ruins. Others dreaded it, knowing hunger and devastation awaited. For the woman's farm, it meant the end of a strange chapter, a return to chores done without foreign hands. The children whispered about it with mixed relief and sadness. The eldest boy muttered that he would be glad to see them gone. His sister clutched the wooden bird tighter, saying nothing. On their last night at the farmhouse, the table was set one final time. The woman had managed to trade with neighbors for extra sugar, enough to bake 2 pies. The prisoners ate in heavy silence, aware that every bite was a farewell. One lifted his fork, paused, then said softly, "Home, not like this." Another nodded, adding, "This we remember." Their words were simple, halting, but carried the weight of truth. When they rose to leave, several paused at the door. One man bowed his head, murmuring, "Danke." Another pressed his hand briefly to his chest in a gesture of gratitude. The eldest prisoner, the one with gray in his hair, met the woman's gaze and said in broken English, "You showed we are men. Not only enemies." She did not reply. She only nodded once, her eyes steady, as though to say the lesson was as much for her as it was for them. Decades later, historians collecting testimonies from former POWs found that many spoke more vividly of American kitchens than of American prisons. They remembered pies, bread, and laughter more hauntingly than guard towers. Some confessed that kindness from ordinary Americans unsettled them more than defeat on the battlefield. One recalled, "I feared the gun. I never expected to fear the gift of bread." Such memories shaped the way post-war Germans viewed America, planting seeds of trust that diplomacy alone could not have sown. For the woman, life continued after the prisoners departed. Her husband returned months later, thinner, older, carrying stories he rarely spoke aloud. When he learned that she had fed German soldiers at their table, he paused for a long moment. Then he said, "I fought so we could be different from them. You made sure we were." It was the only blessing she needed. The eldest boy carried his bitterness longer, though even he could not forget the sight of men once feared as monsters laughing when a cow kicked over a pail of milk. The youngest kept the wooden bird, wings forever frozen in flight, a reminder that even in war, small acts could alter the shape of memory. And for the prisoners, scattered back across a broken Germany, the memory of that table lingered. In letters and memoirs, they returned again and again to the image of a woman standing in a farmhouse kitchen, shawl across her shoulders, placing bread before them without a word. It was not the rifles of the guards that haunted them, nor the fields they worked. It was the unexpected mercy of being treated as men. The war ended in explosions and treaties, in surrendered documents and parades. But in the quiet of memory, one farmhouse kitchen outlasted them all. For the Germans, it was proof that the enemy was not always the monster propaganda had promised. For the woman, it was proof that faith could withstand the weight of hatred. And yet, as history reminds us, such moments were fragile. For every act of mercy, there was another of vengeance. For every table set with bread, another was overturned in anger. But here, on a frozen farm in 1944, kindness became more haunting than cruelty, a memory that endured long after the war was done.